Are rituals running our lives? Do we understand the power of rituals? Are we even aware of our rituals and the impact that they're having on us every single day? Welcome to another Question Lab 42 conversation, where Nicole and I explore a world of different topics and subjects with the intention, really, if there is ever an intention when we have one of our conversations, of just increasing our awareness on things that often are what we call the elusive obvious, right in front of our face, but maybe missed because, you know, when we're in the middle of life, we can't always see the wood for the trees. And the topic that we're going to explore today is the power of ritual. So what do we mean when we talk about a ritual? Well, we talk about any kind of set practice that we may go through in order to elicit some kind of reaction, some kind of state, some kind of different feeling, some kind of deeper connection or bond with another person or with a place or with an experience. And we're all subject, as we'll discover as we go through this conversation, to rituals in different ways, even if it's not something very, very conscious that we're doing when we're going through these ritualistic patterns. Now, when we were preparing for this conversation, we sat down as we normally do, and we were looking through and we were exploring, okay, what would we cover to keep it concise so we don't just create a 7-hour video where we where we talk around endlessly for that period of time, which is another thing we have the potential to do. And you know, we had the books of pages and pages of notes as we were exploring this, and we came to the conclusion that this is such a big topic that the only way to really combine two things, first explore it to its fullest to really discover the gold, and produce, what are clear, concise, and easy to understand videos and easy to follow videos, is to actually break this up into a series of smaller videos. So this is essentially part one of the power of ritual. And the areas of this topic that we're going to cover today are how rituals play a part in our everyday life, how this has changed through the ages, so how humanity has historically observed and practiced rituals versus how we observe and practice them today, how some of the more esoteric practices are still present in the world today, and what do they mean, what is their value, why are they still present, why are they still followed, and finally we're going to explore the growing difference between East and West culture when it comes to rituals, the way we observe them and the way we practice them. So hopefully it'll be quite an interesting topic, and we'll at least scratch the surface on these topics on our call today. So now let's kick this off. Nicole, how do you see rituals playing out in your day-to-day life? How do you observe us as a species, the way we follow rituals, and where do you think they're still present?
Yeah, Nick, you made me laugh before because you were making reference to a 7-hour video. I'm sure we'd be totally capable of doing that. So we know we can hold a conversation for a very long time. Yeah, so rituals in our society, in our life, where do I see them? I think the obvious ones are the personal maturation milestones like birthdays and weddings, or partnerships, not necessarily in church, but anniversaries, people who will celebrate the fact that they've been together for a certain amount of time. Obviously funerals, as we're all going through that process at some point. Then we've got more sort of coming of age rituals, and you can look at different faiths. You can look at the bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, coming of age in the Jewish faith, and you'll find some really interesting processes that people, for example, in certain tribes in the Amazon will go through, where they'll get young boys of 13 or so to put their hands into these what look like oven gloves, full of these bullet ants, and to overcome certain physical strain and apparently very painful process. Or girls in the West Africa who get tattoos when they get married. These are rituals that are more of personal coming of age. Then you've got the collective ones that can either be faith-based, like Christmas, Easter. Some people will do Thanksgiving or the Ramadan, or midsummer festivals if you're from the north, things like that. And then, you know, more nationality based, where you're celebrating the independence of your country, you know. And I don't know of a single country that doesn't celebrate that in one way or another. So those are sort of the obvious ones for me, but I know there are many more. What does it make you think of? Is there anything I missed in this this list?
No, I think that's covered it quite nicely. The one I'd probably add in there are rituals that you kind of adhere to through affiliation to something that you're interested in. So you've separated it nicely there, in so much that, you know, there's these personal ones we have to mark milestones or maturation points in our life, and there's these collective ones we have as societies. And if we look at sport, it kind of has both in one way or another. Like, you know, if you're a sports person, let's say, not necessarily professional, you know, like say a golfer or a tennis player or whatever it may be, you may have your own personal rituals that you go through in order to get yourself into a certain state or a certain energy to then go into performance. But then, you know, the obvious one is the collective of the fan base. You know, they may have their rituals before a game. You know, my background is football or soccer for some people around the world. Back in the UK, and you know, as both a player and a fan, and as a fan, the amount of rituals on game day are incredible. You know, everyone has their good luck thing, their processes they follow, and it's all very organized. So I think that would be the only addition that I would add there. You know, kind of the things that we choose to connect to through a passion for them, sport being a really nice, obvious example. So I think that's quite a nice overview of the different variants and types of ritual. I guess there's also, if we have a look at that on a smaller scale, there's these rituals that we just kind of have within our life. You know, it could be you have the ritual when you first wake up in the morning of you know, going and doing your exercise routine, and then maybe having a coffee afterwards, taking a bit of time to read your book, and then getting into your day. It could be before, you know, going into work, you have a certain ritual, or you and your partner may have date nights once a week or once a month or something like this. And again, it becomes somewhat of a ritual to breed that deeper connection. So I would say out of the more formal ones that we've discussed, that would then just be the other one I'd probably mention in there. But let me ask you a question. Let me ping the ball back over the net to you here. As we're in the sporting zone, let's play the game.
I will drop it.
Why do you think people use rituals? Like, where do you think the value is in rituals, and why is it even a thing?
Well, I think there are different layers. And as you were talking about sports and so forth, I think, you know, you can even touch on superstition for some people. You know, they go through certain rituals for superstitious reasons. But I think sort of as a whole, it's interesting because rituals have been with us since forever. And I think there's different aspects to it. One of them is this connection thing. You know, rituals that we do together, there's this celebration of belonging to something. And I think, you know, whether you're talking about sports or whether you're talking about weddings or funerals, it's when we're gathering people, bringing them together to all celebrate something together, whether it is in happiness or in sadness or in excitement, there's this sense of belonging. And as humans, that's what we need. You know, we need to be able to belong to something. Then there's also this identity thing, which also fits into the belonging. You know, I can identify with other people. I know who I am because I know who they are, and I know my history. So Independence Day typically would be, you know, again, my identity. I relate to being of this nationality, and I remember and I honor, you know, my ancestors who have allowed us to be in a free country, for example, or whatever. So there's this thing about celebrating history and reconnecting with your identity. I think when you talk about the more sort of passages in life, it's also about significance in some way. You know, I think when you know your identity, you feel that you have some form of significance. And the older you get and the more of these passages you go through, you sort of gain in significance and gain in purpose and gain in influence. And I have the feeling that there's an element of that in there. And then I think there's also, and this is the one I like the most because, well, we like to use it as well in our retreats and things like that, is using rituals as a tool. As a powerful tool to connect with either something that you have and that you forgot you had, you know, a resource or something, and just really anchoring that, or on the contrary, getting rid of stuff, you know, getting rid of baggage, getting rid of things that are holding us back, going through rituals to bring things to our awareness so that we can consciously get rid of them rather than just lug them around, you know, without purpose. And all these different elements, I think they're interconnected. So it's not just like either it's this or that. I think very often it's kind of a sum, it's a mixture of all of these things. And that's what makes it so interesting. But I think a really, really interesting part of that is, you know, to what extent we're conscious or unconscious about the rituals, and how conscious and unconscious we want to be about these rituals. And I know that's a topic that you find really interesting. So I'm going to throw the ball right back at you.
I like this sporting analogy.
Yeah. We're going to have to continue this.
Yeah, and I think this conscious or unconscious thing is almost like a theme of Question Lab 42. In many ways, you know, we talk about transformation and the fact that as we move through life, you will transform whether you like it or not. The question is that transformation going to be conscious or is it going to be unconscious? And I think that if we look at our lives, we go through things, you know, we whether we choose to or whether we choose not to, and to bring awareness and consciousness into these moments, we can get so much more from them. And if I have a look at like different rituals, I find this in the same way. I mean, there was a time when I was a young adult in my late teens, and Christmas basically for me was about getting hammered drunk. Like it was an excuse to go out and party, and like for like 3-4 years in a row, Christmas Day morning, I would be an absolute wreck because it was a bit of a tradition in the local area to all go to the big nightclub on Christmas Eve and, you know, get home like 4 a.m. and then just sitting there through Christmas Day with the family trying to talk to you and feeling terrible. And so Christmas was this kind of real hedonistic period, and there wasn't a great deal of consciousness in it. You know, it was just going into it and just an excuse to go and get kind of wrecked. And then as I got to a certain point where that really wasn't serving me anymore, like it ever did, but you know, when I got to a certain point where I stopped doing that, and then started bringing consciousness to the holiday, and this is not to get all religious about it and say, you know, sitting there and saying praise Jesus Christ and all this sort of stuff, but just bringing consciousness to the opportunity to be with your family, bringing consciousness to, you know, not just turning up with a present, but turning up with presence, you know, and being there with them and for them and everything else. And the amazing increase in bond and connection that comes with that. All of a sudden, this thing that I'd done every year for my whole life became so much more amazing, you know, because when I was in my late teens, I was like, oh, Christmas is just for kids. And, you know, when we get to this age, it's just about kind of getting drunk. And then I realized, no, it's about deep connection. And like, I see this play out in many different ways. Like if we have a look, for example, at, you know, we talk about coming of age and going through maturation and moving from childhood into adulthood. You know, these kind of rituals, these coming of age rituals were so present in days gone by. And they still are in some faiths, like you mentioned earlier, bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah in the Jewish faith, and you mentioned some bullet ants in gloves in a tribe in the Amazon. You know me, I'll try most things, especially if they come from the Amazon, but that sounds a little bit much. But so they still exist and they're still present. But in Western culture, I think that they don't consciously exist. Like when I think there's an opportunity for it. So when a child gets to a certain age and they leave the home and they like go to university or something like this, where they potentially go and stay, you know, not just overnight at a friend's house, but they go and stay for months on end in different towns, parts of the country and everything else. This is a great opportunity for somebody to really, if there's awareness there, see it as an opportunity to move into adulthood. And I think it's really dependent on the family that you're from as to whether that frame is provided and some kind of awareness is brought to the fact of that's what's happening. But I do think it's somewhat of a rarity that is the case, because, you know, how many people go to university and don't see it as that opportunity, just go there and get stupidly drunk and, you know, party their arse off and everything like this. And it's not really taken in the same way as you know, these coming of age things could be in different moments. So that, again, for me, is another example of conscious or unconscious, a conscious or unconscious way of being and way of going through something. You know, we can do it either or, and it just really depends what we, you know, which avenue you go on determines what you take from that experience. So I think we all have these rituals. We all go through these things in life, and it is, you know, is your head buried in the sand and are you just going to pull it out one day and realize that a load of time has gone by and nothing has changed for you personally? Or are you going to, you know, keep your eyes open, stay aware, see the lessons, see the opportunities for connection, for gaining a greater sense of identity, for significance, for a tool, for whatever, you know, all of these amazing things that could come from some kind of ritual. But I know that you've done some research into some of these more esoteric practices from around the world, and we touched on this a little bit, but we haven't personally discussed this at any great depth. So do you have any gold or any crazy stuff to share from that research?
You're catching me empty-handed. No, I mean, I've done in-depth research. I find it fascinating, and one of the things that I find fascinating is also understanding the purpose behind certain rituals and losing that purpose. And one of the things I'm thinking of is, for example, Halloween. You know, we tend to think Halloween is this American thing that, you know,
consumer.
They're trying to bring into you know, Europe and other countries, and it's all about money and buying disguises and getting, you know, treats and candy. And it's not, you know, there's so much history behind the whole concept of celebrating the dead, and there are different ways of doing it. You know, you go to Mexico and you've got, and you know more about this than I do, but you know, they have different kinds of celebrations. But when you lose the connection to the purpose of why something was created in the first place, then you can't take anything from it. You know, if all you're taking from it is candy and spending money to decorate your house with, you know, ghosts, then the ritual isn't about the ritual anymore. It's just it's become something else. And I think you were talking before about how the coming of age, you know, rituals in certain countries and certain areas are still very prominent, and you know, whether we talk about the bullet dance and the gloves or other rituals, and, you know, without being very specific, we know of these stories of young men or young women going out there and being challenged and challenging themselves to grow into their own identity. It's pretty much to prove themselves to themselves, you know, maybe also to society to some extent, but mainly, you know, it's like a survival thing. Like, you go out there for a week and you face yourself and you learn to know who you are. You know, find yourself, go out there, find yourself, come back when you know who you are. In our society, all these sort of levels of coming of age or passages, they're all school-based, they're all learning-based, but they're all very, very like fitting the mold. Like, if you know how to learn the way that we decide that you need to learn, then you will get the right grades, and then you can move on to the next level. You know, you graduate from one level to the next. But it's not about finding your identity. It's more about conformity. It's more about fitting in than it is about knowing who you are. Taking a box and saying, okay, now I've done this, now I can move on to the next level. It's almost like a video game. You know? I've figured this one out, move on to the next level. And I speak to a lot of young people, you know, in the coaching environment, who are completely lost. You know, they come out of school, and some even who've done some studies at university, and they're lost because the choices they made were either not based on their true, desires. They were
Mhm.
either sort of suggestions by other people or their parents, or because they didn't know what they wanted, they tried something that in their mind was reasonable because it might open up job opportunities.
Mm.
But it didn't feel like it was connecting them to who they are.
Mm.
And so they come out of university and they're still lost and they don't know who they are. And so I think, we're missing that part of in our society where we are just challenged, we are faced with our own, with ourselves for certain times and come back knowing, what we're capable of and what we can do. And, when my children were younger, I kind of took them through a few rituals like that in a vacation environment. So when my daughter was 12 and my son had not quite 14, I took them to South Africa and we worked for a few weeks in a baboon sanctuary. And it was all about just being there of service to help. And I wanted them to feel what it was like to be able to help without having to, get out your wallet and sort of pay to feed people or whatever. Because as a child, you feel like you can't contribute. But I wanted them to be able to see what it's like to contribute. And it wasn't just about petting little baby baboons. I mean, this was hard work. This was, I'll spare you the details, but it was tough. And and a couple of years later, I took them to the desert and we went, out to the desert for several nights and with camels and so forth. But for me, it was about letting them experience a little bit of hardship, a little bit of toughness, just so that they could measure themselves against themselves and be able to tell themselves, okay, I've done this. That wasn't so easy. I was quite young and I've done this and I survived. So next time I'm faced with a challenge, I can do this because I spent, a few nights in the desert with scorpions and still slept or, been bitten by little baboons. Amongst other things. And I think these kind of rituals that put us, face to face with ourselves and also a little bit of toughness without it just being toughness for the sake of toughness are really useful and are kind of missing in the West.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think, we've over the campfire, actually back at the last Questioner 42 retreat, you told me the depth of those stories where you took the kids out there, and it sounds absolutely amazing, incredibly inspiring, and definitely going to throw Oliver into the middle of a desert at some point. But I agree. There's if I look at my something which I felt was coming of age for me in a certain way when I was younger is that when I got to, how old was I? 20 years old, I think. It's worrying that I forget that age, but something around there. I left the UK. I initially moved to Spain. It was one step out kind of thing, but then I was there for like 9 months and then moved to Southeast Asia, and then was in Southeast Asia for 4.5, 5 years, between Indonesia, Thailand, and then the Philippines. And it was coming of age for me because, I realized the level of privilege that I'd had in the UK, and going to, seeing these amazing high-rise buildings and then right next to them, like these shanty towns where people have absolutely nothing, like seeing the stark contrast, in the UK, things like that are hidden from most people. So you don't, you need to see those things. And obviously they don't exist at that level though. But for me, that was coming of age. There was a real growing up that happened in that moment, and I think you hit the nail on the head when it's like experiencing some kind of hardship or being faced with some kind of hardship. And if we look at the story of the Buddha, I think it's kind of, there's a bit of fable energy to it as well. But the story of the Buddha is that he was a prince in a village or a town or something of this nature, and his father wanted him to follow in his footsteps, and he kept him away from all of the hardship that was in the town. There was extreme poverty in the place they governed over, and to the point that when he was out in the chariot or whatever it was, or in the thing that he'd be taking him around in, they would have certain streets which were maintained at a far higher standard. No poor people allowed, no disabled, everything else. And those were the only streets that the young Buddha, at that point, he hadn't reached that level of enlightenment, but he would be taken down. because his father didn't want him seeing those things. He only wanted him connecting to, more positive things. And there was a moment where he happened upon somebody who was heavily sick and complete starvation and looking at it. And there was a moment of just and then a connection to the fact that, wow, everybody isn't living this perfect life. And while he in that moment hadn't personally experienced that hardship, having an awareness of that hardship became a coming of age moment for him, to the point that he left the riches and everything of his life and then went into this journey of, discovering the source of human suffering, essentially, and understanding it and how to heal it and how to cure it. And this was the early parts of his life. So I think it's a really important point that you mentioned there, this exposure to hardship and to difficulty, to challenge. And when we look at the esoteric coming of age rituals, which still exist in places, around the world, which are somewhat unaffected by this 21st century materialism, and consumerism, which we see in most parts of the world, like in the Amazon and like in certain tribes in Africa. It is the facing of hardship. It's going into the jungle by yourself, or it's, there's that one, I'm sure it might not be one, there's many that do it, but where the young men, when they get to a certain age, they have to stand on top of like this totem pole, which is like 20 foot high. Like if you fall, you're going to really hurt yourself. And they have to stand there still for like a period of days. Like no movement, no food, no water. It's Africa. I'm pretty sure it's hot and there's insects and everything trying to mess with you. And there's the test of kind of going through that and going through something and coming out the other side. So I think it's a really important point to know there. And that's not to say that every ritual in the context of coming of age has to be something difficult. It could just be, nothing. It could be something that's not difficult or extreme adversity. It may be an opportunity to take responsibility, just to step into a role which is leaving the bubble wrap of childhood behind and either moving into experience of adversity or taking on of responsibility or something. But to go back a couple of steps, obviously we're talking about rituals in different ways, and we've gone a bit deep into the rituals of coming of age there, which is probably one of my favorite topics, I have to say.
Yeah, mine as well.
When we're talking about another video, like a part 2, I think that is probably where I most like to go in the next video.
I've got like a few things I've got lined up, and I say, I really want to say this. Am I not allowed to say this?
No, everything is welcome, because again, I think that we could just talk about that one section for the next few hours, but just to voice it out loud, that I think that it would be really amazing for us to have a dedicated course there. But I mean, what else do you have to bring into that part of the conversation?
Well, it's just that, it's true that we were maybe focusing a little bit on the hardship and that thing. And as you say very rightly, it's not about necessarily the hardship, or it's definitely not only about that. I think one of the really important elements of it is also disconnecting from the things, the baggage that you were given as a child, and the rules that you were shown, and to now be able to detach yourself. I think part of becoming an adult is realizing that these rules were there to frame me, to keep me safe. But now I've become my own person, and I need to figure out what rules I want to live by. And so in French, we say cutting the umbilical cord. I don't know if you use that in English as well, as a frame of saying that I am now detaching from my parents in a way that I don't feel dependent on them anymore, but also I don't need to follow their life view.
Yeah.
I can create my own life view. And that is something that we don't celebrate in the West. We still have a lot of, fear of judgment from our parents up till, forever. I mean, I've coached people that were in their 60s who said they were still afraid of their father's reaction, And I think, and you say it so well, you say we end up having a society full of children, 50-year-old children. It's because it's not so much in that respect about hardship. It's about realizing that now I'm going to live the life that I want to live by my own rules. And I'm okay if nobody accepts this or if nobody approves it, because I've become my own person. I've become my own, adult. And I think that's a really, really key element. And this is also why I like through the rituals to, as we do during our retreats, is to let go of that baggage in a really, really beautiful and ritualistic ways, to say, okay, these are all things I've gathered, from my parents and my grandparents, whoever's influenced, it's like a trickle. It's all trickled down. Whatever their experiences was, it trickles down over the generations, and to consciously let go of these things so that we can just be our own person. And call back to you. But yeah, no, I think that. So I was just dying to say that because, I think it's a really, really important part, and I love doing that work. I love doing that work on myself, and I love doing that work with other people. And I think it's just so important. So and to create rituals around that is really powerful.
I completely agree, and I think that it was a beautiful addition that you made there, and I think that I'm definitely sold on the next part of this particular, the ritual series, let's call it, being about maturation in that period, because again, we've in the Question Lab 42 subscription membership, where we have like the main body of the conversations that we've recorded on camera, we go into a lot about the middle passage, which is that period of your life which opens up when there has been a lack of a coming of age experience. Now, if we see the coming of age experience as like the bridge between childhood and adulthood, the thing that gets you over the hump, if there is no bridge, the chasm kind of opens, so to speak. You biologically get older, and the body biologically goes through maturation, but the soul and everything within it does not. And this chasm opens, and this chasm is essentially the middle passage, where in which at some point you fall off the cliff of childhood because you realize that you are just a grown baby. That's probably a little bit blunt about it, and then you fall into this pit of despair, and this is the realm of midlife crisis and and everything else. We go into a great deal of depth of that in the subscription platform, but I think that to explore that at depth in one of these conversations, I think would be good. And again, I think we've got like 3-4 hours of conversation of that in the subscription platform, so you probably won't explore it to that level of depth, but again, going into it, I think on the next conversation could be good. But something that I wanted to come back to, if we have a chance to do that, is we were talking earlier on, so we've gone into the rituals around maturation and moving from childhood and adulthood, and it might not just be from childhood to adulthood. It might be those personal rituals, or those moments, those coming of age moments, which are not being a parent to being a parent, or being a parent, then when the kids fly the coop, to then going back to being oneself, or whatever that may be. There's lots of different ones that sit just outside of the coming of age one. But I wanted to come back to something which I find quite interesting, which is the rituals that we have around death. And of course, I don't think we have a huge amount of time now, so this is probably another call that we're kind of lining up or planting the seed for, because like I find this topic fascinating, and you actually wrote a really amazing article a few days or a week or so ago now on.
We haven't published it yet.
Not published yet, no. On death and your perception of it and your relationship to it. And I'm not going to go into that too much, because I think it's good for that to come out and have its own place. But that kind of triggered a bit of a conversation with us, where we started looking at the different ways in which the ritual or the rituals around death are created. And I think in the West, I know certainly in the UK, we have the funeral process and the rituals that are around that. And there's if we look at the funeral itself as being the big ritual, and then within there's these little micro rituals which all piece together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle to make the whole. And these could be the arriving at the funeral place at the cemetery, and then the walking in single file, and then the carrying of certain flowers, and then the reading of certain words or anything like this. And then there's another one where when the coffin is lowered in, and everyone takes some dirt and contributes to the burial, so to speak. not physically with shovels most of the time, but at least energetically. Although I have been at a couple of really highly emotional and intense funerals in the past where it was a friend who was quite young, and the group of best friends got round and actually completed the thing of the whole, and it was incredibly emotional. But so we have all of these rituals, but I know that for the most part, to kind of celebrate death is not really something that seemed to be in good taste. And I had this conversation with somebody about a week ago where I said, this is difficult to communicate to people, but from my model of the world and the way that I perceive death and the cycle of the recycle of life and everything like this, it becomes very hard to be upset when somebody dies. And that sounds really callous through the lens of Western culture. But for me, there's nothing to be sad about, and I had this conversation with them, and their response was, so what if I died then? Wouldn't you be sad? Like, no, you're not getting my point here. Like, no, firstly, but, not for the reasons that I don't like you, but because, my belief is that we go somewhere else, and, whatever else, that's a different story for a different day. But in looking at the way it's celebrated around the world, one of the most amazing things, is, like if you look in Mexico, for example, they have Dia de Muertos, which is the Day of the Dead. And they've got so many rituals in there to basically celebrate ancestors and the process of death and what death actually means, and the fact that, it's as essential a part of life as being born. It's like light and dark, up and down, in and out. You can't have one without the other. And, when you understand polarity, it's not about having one win over the other, because if one wins over the other, the winner can't exist anyway, because of the law of polarity. They have to coexist. But when you look into the Day of the Dead, it's absolutely fascinating, because they're celebrations, like they create altars to remember the dead. They have like traditional food that they create, but different parts of the day that these different foods come out, and they have certain songs and certain music and face paint and makeup. And when I imagine that if you just stumbled upon it, it would be terrifying. But I imagine if you stumbled upon Halloween, that'd probably be pretty scary if you had no frame of context. Such as little devils and stuff running around the street might be a bit scary. But it's their relationship to death is this amazing, amazing celebration. And what this, the point that I'm taking a little while to make here is that we can look at all around the world and see these different rituals that are attached to different cultures. And it's not to say one is right and one is wrong. That falls into dogma. That falls into, well, my religion's right. Well, hold on a minute. If you're born on the other side of the world, you'd have a different religion. So what would that mean then? Kind of falls into this thing. But I think we're lucky enough, that we live in a time in history in which we have access to and a window in to all these amazing cultures and the way they practice. And for the most part around the world, most of us live within societies where we have the freedom of expression. We can choose how we identify in pretty much every single way. And one of the biggest excitements of my adult life is not being too identified with anything before I've made a conscious choice that it's what really deeply resonates with me, if that makes sense. And it's almost this choosing of the rituals. So it's not to say that you disrespect the rituals from the place that you came from, or you disregard them because of whatever else. If it resonates with you, it resonates with you. Do you know what I mean? But also, I think if we identify with it so much with something that doesn't resonate with us, like, I want to celebrate my mother or my father's life because they passed and it's a celebration, but I'm not going to do that because it's not the right thing to do. Then I think that maybe it's a useful game to check into the ritual that you have around death and the process that you have around it. Maybe there's something more pleasing or fulfilling for you that you can observe. But it's absolutely fascinating. And reading your piece that you wrote, I think it was a week ago or something like that, it really, really connected me with this thought as well. So, I mean, when you were writing that piece, did you do any kind of research into these different things, or was this just a real expression in the moment?
No, I think that was in the moment thing. I didn't even reread it. It was just, I went for a walk and, at night, and certain thoughts just sort of came to me, and I came back and I wrote them down. And even by the time you read it, I couldn't actually, because I think you read it maybe a week or two after I'd written it. I couldn't even remember what I wrote. So it really was just, coming from the heart. But yeah, I think there's so many things you said. I'm like, yeah.
I want to put it in. Sorry about that.
Maybe we are going for the 7-hour conversation. No, but the thing is, there were two things. One was the thing about death and, celebrating it differently. And it's true, some people, our traditional ways, the funerals and I always find them extremely sad, and it's almost like they're putting on music to make you sad, and they're saying things to make you sad, and maybe that is the purpose, so that it's like they're pulling it out of you, like even if you have the strongest possible person say, I'm not going to cry, you end up in tears, and maybe that's the whole point. I don't know. But when I think of the way, for example, when my mother passed away 4 years ago, we decided not to have a funeral. We decided to celebrate her life. So we didn't celebrate her death as such, but we celebrated her life. And again, different way of tackling the fact that she was passing on. And I think, yeah, the way your relationship to death does determine your relationship to life, because in our culture, we have a tendency to fight death. It's sort of like stay alive at all costs, do everything to keep as many people alive as possible. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but sometimes it goes to an extreme where you're thinking this person isn't even living anymore. We're trying to keep them alive for the sake of keeping them alive. Yeah. And it's not as though we can cheat death, right? I mean, it's not as though we're going to find some kind of well, we might, but I'm not sure that's a good idea either. So this whole idea that death isn't part of life, and we have to, we tend to push it away up until the last moment when it actually comes, and then we don't know how to deal with it. I think we're missing that again. If in Mexico, the way they celebrate death in Mexico, it's part of their yearly tradition, and so they're, even if they haven't been faced with death during that year personally, they're faced with it through the celebration of it. They're faced, and so it is part of life. It becomes an integral part of life, and a beautiful part of life, rather than a horrible thing that you want to, not talk about or be affected by. The other thing you were talking about was this whole thing about being able to choose, your model of the world at the end of the day. If you don't like what you were brought up with, you have access to different ways. And it's interesting because we had a conversation this morning about identity with Barbara. And I think the big challenge there is your identity, because the moment you decide that you want to remove yourself from a way of being, and whether you're removing yourself from a certain faith or just traditions, there is so much resistance there, because not only will you have people trying to pull you back in, and not let you go, but you're on your own for a while. The things that you thought you were, that were part of your life, the way you identified to yourself and to everything, is put in question, because all of a sudden you're deciding to go down a different path where things are different and the models are different. And I think the identity piece in that time, and that bridging until you find your tribe, because that whole sense of belonging, that's attached to these traditions, it becomes a really, really thin thread, and you're going towards the unknown, and you're on your own. And I think it is a beautiful middle passage thing. And and again, coming of age, we're having to know who we are and what we want, and that's a difficult time, but for good reason, because then when we do find what we want, and we do find our tribe, and we do find people who are like-minded, now we can connect with ourselves, our true self, and not just a model that was handed down. But those are yeah, exciting and challenging times. So I needed to and I was really worried I'd forget about the second part, and I was like hanging on to it.
No, it's good. So I went off on a tangent and just created loads of jump off points, and you had to just select jump off all of them. But no, I think it's, I think that's that's a really, really nice place for us to kind of move towards the conclusion of this particular conversation. Actually, is, you know, I think we've touched a lot as we go through here on. We touched a lot on this conversation. Sorry, on you know, what ritual is and how ritual is present in our lives, whether we choose to observe it or not. But I think the one thing that I'm left with here is a reaffirmation of the importance of bringing conscious awareness into those rituals, because a lot of these things we're going to go through them whether we like it or not. And you know, we can either choose to bury our heads in the sand and pull it out a little while later and be exactly the same person, or we can choose to be aware in those moments and grow and take lessons and mature. And you know, it's everybody's choice. There's no right, there's no wrong. It's just whatever you want to do. It's the beauty of free will. But I think it's a great place to come to on this conversation, especially the awareness around what rituals are you subject to, and have you chosen those, and do they serve you? And you know, how has society or a particular identity which you've been given determined which rituals you do and do not practice? Yeah, I think it's a beautiful place to draw, you know, to come towards a conclusion. So I think, you know, my final piece that I would say is just my two areas that are really excited me most in this conversation were the talk of coming of age rituals and what they are and how they can be. And I would love us to explore that in another conversation deeper, specifically that piece, because there's a whole thing about creating your own rituals and that is really, 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 really powerful as well. And so I think that'd be a really cool one to explore next. But then after that, I think going deeper into, I was going to say, going deeper into death, you know. that's a good one, isn't it? That's juicy. But going deeper into the rituals that we have around death and the cultural understandings and you know, what that could be and how much our model of the world is influenced by that. And you know, yeah, because you raised a really good point, and I'm not going to go deep into it now as we're touching it, but the music that's used in traditional funerals in the West, which is there to kind of elicit a feeling of, you know, it does make you sad. And it's almost this feeling in particular Western-based faiths that you're not paying respect unless you're feeling sad. And there's a punishment. There has to be some kind of connection to pain in order to be truly, you know, whatever. So I think there's some really interesting stuff around that. So that's, I think, my final piece there, is that it's been an amazing conversation. I'm excited to explore those two pretty soon. But that's just my final piece. You may have a few more cans of worms that you have sitting under the camera there.
No, I wouldn't dare to open them because where that would lead. No, I agree. There are so many topics that are still there to be unearthed in that respect, and so many stories to tell, that I think I will also leave it at that. And just, yeah, thank you for this conversation, and looking forward to episode 2, 3, 4, 5.
We're going to need a new channel for rituals, I think.
Yeah, well, rituals, yeah, I mean, it is such a big, we live, you know, our life is a series of rituals. And like you say, you know, either we're aware of them or not, and either we take transformation into our hands or not. But we will transform no matter what, and rituals will be part of our life whether we realize it or not. So we may as well, you know, be conscious of them, be aware of them, and choose them so that they serve us rather than serve against us. So love this topic.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Absolutely. So on that note, I hope people watching it enjoyed it as much as we did. If not, then hey, we had a good time. We had a good time. So yeah, thank you for watching. If you are, Nicole, thank you for your time as always, and we'll see you soon.